We greet you today from the occupied lands of the Multnomah, Clackamas, Tualatin, Molalla, and Kalapuya tribes, known to most of the nation as Portland, Oregon. On the screen right now, you see those who will be giving personal and expert testimony throughout this afternoon. And I'm going to invite everybody to video off until you are one of our speakers. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Rabbi Debra Kolodny. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm the executive director of Portland United Against Hate and the rabbi of Portland's UnShul. I greet you today on behalf of the hosts of our gathering, Portland United Against Hate, Unite Oregon, First Unitarian Portland, and the Portland Metro People's Coalition. Thank you so much for attending this afternoon's forum and press conference on police violence against the people of Portland. We have over 10 press representatives and over 335 participants, plus the panelists you see in front of you. A note that closed captioning is available. There should be an icon at the bottom of your screen, although I am not seeing it. And as you can see, we have ASL interpretation as well. Today, we feature over a dozen firsthand stories from those targeted by state violence, so you can learn the truth of the ongoing, intentional, flagrant use of military force by police in this city against those exercising their First Amendment right to speak out for Black Lives Matter and against police violence. On the night of May 29th, 4 days after the death of George Floyd, Portland protesters were attacked by police. Since then, except for the days when our air quality was unbreathable, Portland has been in the streets every night. With only a handful of exceptions to that, we've been met with extreme police violence. Despite the 99% peaceful activity of the protests, illegal gatherings or riots are declared, and tear gas, flashbangs, pepper spray balls, rubber bullets, and batons come out as the kettling begins. Media, legal observers, and medics are targeted. On July 4th, when the feds came, it became only slightly worse. Yet many decry the violence of the protesters, making false equivalencies between yelling and throwing water bottles into empty plazas and the use of military munitions. And many persist in thinking perhaps that there may be a few bad apples on the police force, but the police are just doing their job. Yet this call to violence is not from individual police, it is PPB policy. They have made no efforts to de-escalate. A community letter was sent to the mayor at the end of July with 12 demands, including that munitions not be used and that police exclusively work to de-escalate tensions if necessary. Except for the departure of the feds and the mayor's banning of one flavor of tear gas by PPB months later, none of the demands have been met. The protesters and bystanders you will hear from today were all assaulted without cause. All of them were brutalized. After this firsthand testimony, you will hear from 8 experts on the physical, psychological, and financial harms caused by this rampant militarized assault on your neighbors. You will also hear from world-renowned experts on policing and on the threat posed by the relationship between white nationalists and the police. There will be 15 to 20 minutes for questions from the press, moderated by journalist Arun Gupta, who we have been honored to work with on this forum. Michelle will call each speaker by their first name and invite them to expand on that with their full name and pronoun, and, if relevant, the organization they represent. They will also keep time. I'd like to pass the floor now to an educator and activist many of us have formerly known as Lilith Sinclair. I'll allow them to introduce themselves to the community at large. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Deb. I'm so honored to be here. I'd like to introduce myself for those who don't know me and those who already may. For a long time, many of you have known me as Lil Sinclair, but I've recently come out as Two Spirit, and as such have changed my name. So the name that I'm going by now is Kaniku NuKezi. So go ahead and update all of your contact informations. I'm so sorry for how many people have to do so, but I just want to start out today by giving a special thanks to all that are here to share their stories of police brutality and of assault that's happened here in Portland, Oregon. I want to applaud you for your strength, for your courage, for your devotion to continue on despite brutality, whether it be as a Black person experiencing the day-to-day violence of police brutality that we're also used to, or those who have come out to fight in the last 100 plus days. I've been asked today to give remarks to help set the context of this event and the framework of the current global movements rising up to join the fight that Black and Indigenous peoples have been waging against colonialism for millennia. One which raises a rallying call for Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty. This fight for survival against genocide is undoubtedly dependent on not just the total abolition of policing and prison systems, but also the complete deconstruction of racial capitalism and white supremacy worldwide. We exist in a moment compared often to the civil rights movement, but it is vitally important for us to understand the compounded traumas that we as a global community are experiencing with consideration for the international COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we gather to understand, explain, and put a spotlight on the especially horrific actions of not just local and federal police, but also our own often complicit elected officials who continue to prioritize capital, money, and wealth over the lives of our most marginalized neighbors and loved ones. The movement that we fight here in Portland, like the movement that we see across the world, is one for liberation beyond the need for capitalism as a means of survival. Instead, it's one that understands that the entire construction and foundation of not just this country, but so many settler states across the globe is dependent upon this genocide that we see reflected upon our most marginalized Black, Brown, Indigenous, and multi-marginalized communities. Today, Black people across the country and across the world woke up to the news of Breonna Taylor's killers being indicted for property damage. It's unsurprising to so many of us because something that we've been trying to explain for centuries is that the United States, as an imperialist global capitalist society, has always prioritized profit, capital, and money over the lives of its people. This is true across centuries and across different types of government classes, whether it be the kings of centuries ago or the presidents of today. It's important that we understand that the Black Lives Matter movement is not just a new movement. Instead, it is an abolitionist movement that was started on the very slave ships that brought our people into the diaspora. I hope today that as we listen to the experiences had by so many different people in so many different circumstances, we can understand the truth that this does not begin and end with the genocide of Black and Indigenous lives. While it does begin with our genocide, both physical, literal, and cultural, it does not end there. And we watch as we continue to slide into a fascist regime that is not new, but instead was the very blueprint for the genocides of yesterday. It's of vital importance today that we all are coming together to understand that the chains that oppress us are all connected. whether it be the fight against ableism, or the fight against fat phobia, or the fight against heteronormativity in our societies. Colonialism has continuously put us into boxes that humans were never supposed to be placed into. So today, we're gathering to have an opportunity to listen to not only the people, but to experts here today to show you and tell you about all of the histories that we are seeing converge here in this moment. I thank you so much, Rabbi Deb, for the introduction. Again, my name is Kaniku, my pronouns are they, them, and I'm honored and frustrated to be here all with you again today, as we've been having these discussions for so many years, and now's the moment that we're hoping that they stick. So thank you for being here, and I yield the floor.
Okay, next, we're going to be hearing from a number of testifiers about their personal experiences while protesting here in Portland. First up is Nate Cohen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nate Cohen. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a former EMT and street medic, and I'm here to just do a sort of quick rundown about police weaponry that's used at protests, so that as everyone else coming after me is testifying, there's some context to that. This is incredibly sort of surface level reductive, but just so that everyone understands the terminology and the things that are being talked about. I'm going to share my screen here. I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to pull up just so there can be some visual aids, and I'm going to try to do everything I can to go through this efficiently and clearly. So to start, chemical weapons. Tear gas and pepper spray are the two most common chemical weapons people experience while out at protests. Tear gas is officially deemed CS gas, though a similar compound that's called CN gas is regularly used as well. It's actually an aerosolized powder rather than a gas, and it causes trauma to the tear ducts, the mucous membranes, and the respiratory system, basically making it so that it's hard for you to see and hard for you to breathe. It causes severe coughing, which—
turn your video off so that
yes,
we can get access to the interpreter. Thank you.
Yes, of course, sorry. Go. Okay. Anyway, so one of the biggest concerns with tear gas at the moment, of course, is that it causes coughing, which in the midst of a respiratory pandemic can be contributing to the public health crisis there, along with the individual impacts as well. Tear gas has also been known to cause vomiting, miscarriages, and other forms of severe respiratory distress. The long-term effects of repeated exposure to tear gas have never been studied in depth, but people who've been exposed to it have reported many symptoms, including gastrointestinal problems, loss of senses of taste and smell, burning sensations in the throat and lungs for many days afterwards, disruption of menstrual cycles, and long-term respiratory consequences. Tear gas can also linger in the air for upwards of 15 to 20 minutes and has been measured traveling over a mile from dispersal sites in strong wind conditions in some cases, which means it's going far, far away from wherever it's intended to be used. Tear gas is generally deployed from small grenade-like devices, which can be either thrown or launched. Pepper spray is designed to cause significant pain and burning of the eyes and respiratory system. It's officially designated as OC spray. It was created by Cameron Logman for the FBI in the 1980s, and he has since widely and vocally and repeatedly condemned its use as a crowd control weapon. It was designed to be used to incapacitate individuals, and he has repeatedly stated that it was never intended for indiscriminate use on crowds. And that is deployed either from handheld sprayers or large spray guns that look sort of like super soakers. Impact munitions, or less lethal rounds. These are commonly referred to as rubber bullets, but officially carry the designation of kinetic impact projectiles. There are several main categories: baton rounds, bean bags, pepper balls, and foam or sponge rounds. Here's just a quick image of these. The black one in the upper left-hand corner is a form of baton round. Beanbag rounds are actually buckshot from like a 12-gauge shotgun that have been put into a bag. Pepper balls are small. They look like paintballs. They're fired out of the launcher in the upper right-hand corner. And foam and sponge rounds, there's a variety of kinds of these. The most common ones used by the Portland Police Bureau are fired from something called an FN 303, and there's an example of that down there at the bottom. The risks of impact projectiles. As I said, there are a lot of varieties, and even just the 4 that I covered don't cover the full spectrum of them, but most of them travel at speeds anywhere from 90 miles per hour to 240 miles per hour. They can be made of metal, hardened plastic, or wood. Many of them are also modifiable to include some chemical weapon element. The foam rounds, for example, when they impact your body, disperse pepper spray powder. The pepper balls are like paintballs, but rather than being filled with paint, they're filled with OC. One of the biggest problems with them is that they are largely considered inaccurate at distances of greater than 50 feet, but deemed unsafe to be used if they're within 25 feet. So there's a very, very small target window where manufacturers of these weapons consider them safe to be used on humans, and at ranges larger than that window, they're not accurate enough to be sure that you're hitting what you're shooting at, and at ranges smaller than that window, the force of impact is much too high to be safe for use on people. They've also been clearly designated as not being fired at heads, groins, or other vulnerable areas, and as you will hear, that has not been true. One study in the UK has also found that the use of impact rounds has a 17% rate of causing injuries requiring hospitalization or death, which is horrifyingly high. Explosive devices, flashbangs. Flashbangs cause a severely loud noise. They emit a super bright light, and that can cause permanent hearing and vision damage. Stinger grenades are a small kind of grenade that has a number of small marble-like pellets inside of them that they blast out in a 50-foot radius. And aerial warning and signaling munitions are essentially flashbangs that go off in the air. When they're launched out of weapons, they travel over 200 miles an hour. I'm going to wrap up here, but the biggest problem we see with a lot of these weapons is that often they're used in ways they aren't supposed to be. The Portland police use many of these things out of a 40mm launcher, and they regularly will fire tear gas canisters or flashbangs at people directly using the grenades as impact weapons, which they're not designed to be doing. I myself was shot in the chest with one of those by a DHS officer in July. And suffered a severe chest wall contusion. The image on the left is what it looked like 2 days later. The image on the right is 2 weeks later. This was, I would say, a relatively minor injury compared to many people. So thank you for the time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Nate. Next up will be Andre Miller.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me on this platform to be able to voice our opinions or actually our stories of what happened to us. My name is Andre Miller. I'm a 37-year-old Black man born and raised here in Portland, Oregon. I'm a father of 4 kids. On the night of July 22nd, I thought I was going to become another hashtag. I thought my kids would wake up to the news that I was killed. I thought I was saying my last words on live video as I was bleeding profusely. My fiance was there the night I got shot in the head with an impact munition while peacefully protesting against police brutality and for systemic change. My fiance likely saved my life. I recall that there were hundreds of protesters all close together when we began to get tear gassed. As we began retreating, I felt something hit me in the head and almost knocked me to the ground. I quickly realized that I was squirting blood out of my head. I lost sight of my left eye as it filled with blood. I turned to my fiance and said, "I'm hit, I'm hit." She yelled. She was also hit by police weapons. "I'm hit in the head," I said in a panic, and she quickly applied pressure to my wound. I began to lose consciousness and I passed out. I thought I was gonna die. I said, "Tell my kids that I love them and to keep the fight going." I was carried to a safe vehicle where I was tended to until paramedics arrived. It took me an hour and a half to get to the ER to receive proper medical treatment. On the CAT scan, metal fragments from the impact munition lit up on my scalp. The doctor said I was lucky to not get hit, lucky to get hit where I did, because any lower, I could have lost my eye. I received 7 stitches. The injury has caused me to deal with confusion, loss of memory, anxiety, PTSD, in which I'm currently seeking treatment and counseling for. My kids have been traumatized. They fear for my safety. They fear for their safety. My 5-year-old worries about me every time I leave the house. He says, "Dad, are you going to die?" What happened to me shouldn't happen to anybody. This country is supposed to stand up for freedom, and yet standing up for my First Amendment right got me shot and could have left my kids without a father. That's all I have, and thank you for letting me be able to voice my story.
Thank you for sharing your story, Andre. Next up, we have Erica Christensen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Erica Christensen. My pronouns are she, her. I'm 28. I was born here in Portland. On August 9th, I was violently attacked by a Portland police officer while standing outside of a friend's apartment building. There was a protest in Kenton that night taking place, so I walked out to the sidewalk to bear witness to what was happening. In the peaceful protests all too often met with violence by the police. After telling an officer to leave the neighborhood, he violently pushed me to the ground. Immediately after hitting the ground, he stood directly over me and fired 5 super quick rounds into my body at close range. I was writhing and sobbing on the sidewalk when my friend picked me up and helped me back into their apartment. The initial shock of the assault rendered me completely vacant and horrified at the same time. After going to the urgent care to have my wounds assessed by a physician, I was able to reflect more on what happened. Each of the rounds that hit my body had broken the skin, the locations of the wounds seemingly targeted at my sexual organs. It seemed purposeful that at such close range, he shot me in the breast and groin area. I was in such intense pain that even wearing clothes for days afterward was unbearable. The bruising started to fade after 2 weeks, and I still currently have 2 small hematomas where I was hit in the breast and the lower pelvic area. There's a sizable knot in my hip from being pushed to the ground, but the damage to my mental health has had long-lasting effects as well. The assault has left me with heightened anxiety and depression, which ultimately hinder my ability to participate in the peaceful protests aimed at creating lasting change for Black lives, which was part of, my life, was going to those peaceful protests. And now I'm, scared all the time. I feel very privileged and grateful to be alive and able to share my story today. It hasn't been that way for so many people, so I feel lucky to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erica. The next presenter will be Trip Jennings. Trip, are you on mute? Sorry. And we need your video as well. Thank you.
There we go. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity to share our stories, all the folks who've been injured. I'm a filmmaker and a journalist. I run a video production company in Portland, and I'm a credentialed journalist, and we do work for organizations like National Geographic, PBS, and many others. On the night of July 25th, I was working, as I have been kind of all over the world covering protests in places like the West Bank, Oaxaca, Standing Rock, and in Portland. And I've actually experienced a lot of the munitions that we're talking about in sort of low-level warfare zones like the West Bank. And I'm constantly shocked at what's been deployed summer in Portland, including one thing that was new to me. So on the night of July 25th, I was shooting photos and video on Salmon outside the Justice Center. There was a huge volley of tear gas. The crowd began to move up Sand Street, and sort of after a block away, crossing 4th, just this huge volley of impact munitions hit the ground around me, stuck behind a car. And when the shooting stopped, I got up, and as I've done times in places that are where unrest is happening, but not an actual war zone. I put my camera, my hands up, and moved away as the officer had told everyone to do. Turned back, and when I looked around to see if the officers were still there, I got hit in the face in my body with a handful of impact units. And one of them hit the eye lens of my gas mask, which plastic lacerated my face and my eye, and actually exploded inside of my mask with pink paint and metal shot. And I believe it was that FM303 that was mentioned earlier, because of the paint and all of that metal shot. In the ER, I received 8 stitches, and I had a piece of metal lodged in my eye, which I used to shoot photos and video. And so a week later, I had surgery to remove the metal. And I mean, I got incredibly lucky that where that metal lodged in my eye didn't cause worse damage than it did. The effect on me and my family was pretty huge. My wife is pregnant, and from a supportive husband of a very nauseous partner to needing care. And instead of doing my job, I ended up spending a lot of money on medical care. Just trying to cover people exercising their First Amendment rights. At this point, I've spent $3,000 on this and haven't even received the surgery bill. I lost a week of work, and this was I run a production company. I have 5 employees. Losing that much time in the middle of COVID, when small businesses really was a challenge, and we're really still feeling the impact of that at this point in our work. But I think the most important thing about this is the chilling effect that this kind of policing has on the media. In another part of my life, I might have been back out and finished my story, but with the baby on the way, we decided the risk was too high. So I did the story I was producing, and I haven't covered the protests since. And I feel. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Trip. We've gone over your time, but thank you so much for sharing your story.
Copy that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Samira Green.
Hi, my name is Samira Green, and I just moved to Portland, to the States actually 2 years ago from Kenya in East Africa. And I remember June 2nd, my husband and I and my 2 stepkids and his friend, I was like, I'm not gonna stay in the house anymore. I have to go downtown, to support the Black Lives Matter movement. And to me, it was something new, because it's not, back in Kenya, we don't experience race as it is here, which was kind of shocking for me. So I remember we had a talk, and we're like, we're just going to support, no causing any ruckus, and it's going to be a peaceful protest. By 6:15 we were downtown, and we went to Pioneer Square, and people were just giving speeches, and it was kind of like a festive mood. People were giving speeches and just chanting, and that's all. By 7:45-ish, we heard that there was a group that was coming from over the bridge. So we went there to meet up with them, and we just marched and chanting the names. And so around 9-ish, I remember, and we met up with other friends. I remember the police were talking about do not touch the fence, and they'll be forced to use physical force. And I'm like, nobody's doing anything. So my husband climbed up, we were a block away, climbed up the dumpster to check what was going on, and nothing was happening. And I remember people raising their hands up, and it was like, hands up, don't shoot. And before we know it, there was panic behind us, and they were like, the police is shooting tear gas from behind. And it's like we were being rounded up in one area. So trying to escape, because then I was 22 weeks pregnant, and we were like, okay, maybe it's time to go home. And I was already tired. So we're trying to take a safe exit, only to be ambushed by tear gas and flashbangs. And one tear gas just flew by my husband's head and just landed just a few feet in front of me. And with the flashbangs, you can't see. So we just walked through it. I can't breathe, I can't see. And yeah, I was just worried that I was gonna have a miscarriage. And I just hope that, you know, all this ends someday. It's a sad situation that we have to live in. And it's a sad reality that I have to live in, being in America, thinking that it's progressive, only to see that it's actually not. So that's all I have. That's the summary.
Thank you very much, Samira, for sharing that story. I appreciate it. Our next presenter will be Rodney Graves. Pepe, can you take off the mute and start your video? Okay, Rodney, we're going to come back to you. We will take another, oh, looks like you're ready.
Go ahead.
You ready?
Can we skip it and then let me reach on the phone?
Do you want us, I can come back to you if you're not ready.
Please, please.
Okay, okay, thank you. Let's go to Tracy Molina.
Hi, my name is Tracy Molina. I am mestiza, a mixture of Native American and European descent. I was raised in Siletz, Oregon. I've lived in Portland for about a year now, or a little over a year. I moved here, I'm a veteran. I moved here to get treatment for PTSD at the Veterans Hospital, but that got shut down by COVID. I've been an activist for a long time. Before this, I was mostly working on pipelines for a few years. But moving here, I started working with other activists that are protecting Portland against violent white supremacists that come here, and I joined I was at the first Black Lives or Justice for George Floyd protest in Portland at the end of May. Since then, I've been arrested 5 times in the last just 2.5 months. I might get emotional because one of them was last night, and you could probably see bruises all over my arms. It's always really dangerous when the media's not there, because if there's no one to take pictures and prove what happened, they're more violent and they can get away with more. But I was going to share, I've been shot 7 times in the last few months. 4 by baton bullets, which are the ones that cause deep tissue damage. The damage caused by baton bullets are, to me, from my experience of what other bullets I've been shot by, are much more severe. It took me about 6 weeks to be able to walk without pain after getting shot twice in one leg. And then I was shot twice in the stomach, once by Bortac just for getting a medic for a kid that was shot in the head. out of the 7 times I've been shot, four of them have been in the like bikini area. So they're aiming at places they should not be aiming. I don't even count the times I've been shot by pepper balls because too many to count. There was an incident a few months ago where I was punched in the face by a federal officer after being told to walk through them by another federal officer. And then about 15 minutes later, I got bull rushed by a PPB and hit again. So I had got a concussion from that. So I've had like multiple like minor injuries. I've been to the hospital 3 times, but I've never been hospitalized. That's about all I have to share.
Thank you so much, Tracy.
Thank you.
We'll come back to Rodney in a minute. We'll go next to Armonia. If anybody has trouble hearing, you can put your cursor down at the end, the bottom of the screen, and you can hit closed caption, and that might help you if anybody needs some help with that. Now we're going to hear from Armonia.
Hello, my name is Armonia. I live in North Portland. On August 4th, at a peaceful assembly across from the Portland Police Union building, a driver of a pickup truck attempted to run over protesters and then threatened journalists while wielding a gun. The police did not pursue him. Instead, police stormed the protest, firing smoke grenades from high-impact launchers. I reminded officers that a truck had just tried to run people over and that our right to assemble and protest against injustice is protected by the Constitution. An officer shot a smoke grenade at me, hitting me in the leg and causing soft tissue and bone contusion. The edema from the contusion ran all the way to my ankle, and more than 6 weeks later, I continue to have neuropathy in the area, causing numbness and shooting pain into my ankle. It is painful when standing for longer periods. Then on August 29th, I was violently assaulted by a far-right protester during a peaceful Black Lives Matter daily solidarity protest. Trying to defend myself, I warned him I would mace him, to which he responded, "Good, mace me, fucking mace me, bitch." He continued to assault me, so I maced him in self-defense. Then he punched me in the head, knocked me to the ground, and kicked me in the head and chest, causing me to lose consciousness. Police arrived minutes later, interviewed witnesses, and watched video of the assault. Despite his clear-cut aggression, they refused to arrest the man who assaulted me or take him for mental health check. Instead, they took him to a trusted friend's house. I, on the other hand, was held even after saying I was in pain, my vision was blurry, and I urgently needed to go to the hospital. Police refused to allow me to leave, saying you can't just mace someone and then leave. But apparently, you can beat a woman and Portland police will give you a ride to a friend's house. When I was finally allowed to leave, the police gave me a form in which they labeled the vicious assault on me as harassment. My injuries are very painful and have had a huge impact on my life. I had to return to the emergency room because my doctor was worried about a brain bleed. The concussion is so severe I cannot safely drive more than 10 minutes before I get dizzy. I cannot tolerate more than a few minutes of computer screen time before I become dizzy and my vision blurs. My chest, where I was kicked, is still very sore, and I'm only recently able to take a deep breath without pain. I have not been sleeping well. I have anxious dreams. I have had to obtain a restraining order against my attacker. It seems to me that the PPB is incapable of neutrality and are acting out of self-interest only, resulting in state-sanctioned counter-protesters. Thank you.
Thank you, Armonia. Is Rodney Graves available to join us? Okay, let's go to Elijah Warren.
Hi, my name is Elijah Warren. I'm a single father of a 13-year-old son and a homeowner. On September 5th, My son, his best friend, and myself was tear gassed by the Portland police in our home. I would describe the incident as traumatizing and terrifying. The boys and our dog were screaming with fear. Our home was filled with some type of chemical gas. It took about 30 minutes to get the boys' eyes from burning. I then went outside to figure out what was going on. I seen most of my neighbors standing in their front yards. They were saying the Portland police tear gassed our neighborhood. I then went to find an officer. While I was talking to an officer about the gas, I was viciously assaulted by a second officer. The officer blindsided me with his baton, striking me in my head. I felt blood gushing from my ear right away. I was dazed and confused. My head was aching. The first officer started to yell, "No, no, he's a homeowner," as if the unprovoked attack would have been justified if I was a peaceful protester. I requested the information of the officer who assaulted me, but the other officers ushered him away. As the dizziness set in, my neighbors and my friends walked me home. I was taken to the hospital where I suffered a concussion and I received stitches to close my wound. The Portland police were operating like a criminal gang. My son and his friend is now afraid of Portland police. In my opinion, Portland police are the ones that are completely out of control. The protesters are not the ones who are a threat in Portland. Thank you for you guys' time, and that's my story.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Elijah. Next up, we have Philip Wolf.
Hi there. My name is Philip J. Wolf. My sign name is this. I don't use pronouns. I go by Philip. So to try to put this in 3 minutes with regards to my experience with the police force during protests, that might be tough, but I'll do my best. So it was an unfortunate occasion, and it's very unfortunate with what's happening in America. It's not only happening in Portland. The police's response to the protests in particular, with Black Lives Matter, talking about that specifically, was just a runaround of violence, beatings, tear gas being used. It was a mess. And all of the access that we already were barely getting by with was taken away, and it was blocked. So that was a major concern, and it really put us at risk, especially for people with disabilities. So with my experience, the situation that I want to mention, I was with a friend who was also an interpreter, and they were volunteering their time interpreting. Now, they weren't just interpreting what was the police were saying and their warnings. They were also interpreting sound, what was going on, helping me to make informed decisions, whether or not I should evacuate or stay or respond in a certain way. So it empowered me to make decisions because I had that kind of access. So I want to emphasize that. So the interpreter was with me, and we were just chilling. And, without warning, the police just started shooting tear gas. Now, it was going over our heads and just blowing up. And I would say it was a pretty large crowd at the time. I'd say about maybe 1,000 to 3,000 people. So I got caught up in the middle of this tear gas. I didn't have goggles on. I just had my face mask. So I had to pull my mask down, cough, my eyes were tearing up. And then the police started to kind of do a bull rush through the crowd. And my interpreter friend pulled me by the shirt. And I, of course, at first I just pushed him off. But I did have to recall, wait a minute, I don't know what's going on. I can't hear and I can't see now because of the tear gas. So I decided to trust him and allow him to lead me and follow him through the crowd. And so I was staggering, and this was all still being filmed. And we got out of the ruckus that was happening, and I was able to get my breath. So that particular situation was extraordinary. I mean, I'm just giving you a very small sample of what happened, but throughout the nights, there were different experiences, different injuries, different kind of violent approaches with the police. Now, I do want to emphasize, I've been involved in many different protests here in Portland, the 11 years that I've been here. The police showed up in riot gear, even when protests weren't happening. And sometimes what would happen is, in particular, the police wouldn't even show up. But with Black Lives Matter, they did. And then, like, for example, the #MeToo movement or March for Our Lives. And there were other kind of movements going on. The police allowed those marches to go on without any, they weren't bothering at all. But with Black Lives Matter, they showed up in riot gear. What's going on with that? And the protesters were peaceful. They weren't throwing any rocks or throwing any items. They weren't vandalizing anything. But then the police showed up with tear gas, caused all kinds of confusion and just mass hysteria, and blamed the protesters. So then you have the militarized weapons, people being injured. I had to be brought to the ER along with others. So with that whole experience, I'm only giving you a small little piece of the puzzle there. I mean, it's really not enough to emphasize my whole experience. So thank you for your time.
For testifying, Philip. Our next presenter will be Michael Weisdorf.
Hello, my name is Michael Weisdorf. My pronouns are he and him. On July 18th, I attended a rally and march for Black Lives Matter in North Portland. Hundreds of us were exercising our First Amendment rights outside the office of the Portland Police Association when officers declared a riot. We began leaving the area as directed when Portland police officers charged toward the crowd, shoving and hitting anyone within reach, creating a dangerous stampede-like environment, even as we were following their instructions. For several blocks, I moved as fast as I could with people in front of me and police just behind. But then I was suddenly knocked to the ground from behind without warning. As I tried to get to my feet, officers surrounded me, yelling at me to keep moving. One officer threw me to the ground a second time, breaking my elbow. I staggered away, visibly in shock and bleeding from my arm and face. I had broken no law and followed every instruction that was given. I spent the next 3 days in the hospital, having surgery to repair the open fracture of my left forearm and taking antibiotics. Both my arms, as well as my knees and face, were still badly injured when I left the hospital later that week. And I was hard-pressed to explain to my 6-year-old why his dad had been beaten up by the police. I was left to reflect on the fact that I could be considered lucky. Other protesters have been shot with so-called less lethal munitions and gravely injured. Other victims of unjust and unnecessary police violence have lost their lives. Those tragedies are, of course, what had brought us to protest in the first place. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Michael, for sharing that story. Our next presenter will be Andrew Tolman.
Hello, my name is Andrew Tolman. I'm an ASL interpreter currently living in Portland. Exactly 1 month ago today, I was arrested while standing on the sidewalk at a Portland protest while out recording myself facilitating information that I saw and heard in American Sign Language for Facebook Live. After being thrown to the ground twice with my head smashed into the concrete, my gas mask saved my life, and a heavy knee pressed deep into my back, I sat for a total of 10 hours and experienced mocking, misgendering, and neglect. However, I am alive, and both my charges and injuries are minor. I knew arrest was a possibility. I knew that I would experience violence, often called policing, and that my arrest was not a surprise to me, and is one of only nearly 1,000 arrests over the last 100 days. Police announcements, police press conferences, and arresting police policies and tactics of officers while conducting violence against nonviolent protesters are all completely inaccessible, ableist, and therefore inherently white supremacist. Portland police, working in tandem with DHS, ICE, FBI, and many other militia and police groups, give inaccessible instructions to nonviolent protesters, assuming that piercingly loud verbal information is accessible and successfully received by everyone on the streets. I would be out protesting regardless, as is my right, but I specifically and repeatedly go to the frontline actions for the purpose of live streaming information into American Sign Language for viewers that receive information in that way. I also frequently am down with deaf and ASL using protesters exercising their rights and have been brutalized while clearly marked with a shirt that says ASL interpreter on the back. According to studies, nearly half of murders done by police are of people with disabilities. These numbers would be higher if we had equity in healthcare, mental health care, destigmatized neurodivergent behaviors, especially those that occur in Black men and boys. Also consider language deprivation of deaf and sign language using individuals, indigenous hand speakers, and neurodivergent people with non-traditional communication styles. Black and disabled people are killed for their neurodivergence, while white supremacist murderers get legal protection and sympathy for theirs. Consider the hundreds, if not thousands, of people with disabilities murdered in the middle of a crisis, most of which often don't get a hashtags. Names that we do repeat, like Christopher Kolodny, Sandra Bland, Elijah McClain, Eric Gardner, Andre Gladden, and countless others had disabilities, but we rarely hear these parts of their stories. We cannot talk about racism in this country without discussing ableism. I was arrested and brutalized and would rather be arrested and brutalized 1,000 more times than lose one more person to the police state. We need to abolish not only the Portland police, but Portland as an American city, Oregon as a white supremacist American state, and abolish the United States of America as it stands. Let this country burn so that it can be reborn. Now is the time for white rage to be used to fuel Black and Indigenous movements for their own liberation and sovereignty. Fuck Ted Wheeler, Black Lives Matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Our last presenter, unless we have Rodney with us, let's go to Mike Hasty. Mike, are you able to join us? Okay, how about Rodney? Rodney Graves? All right, so we are now going to conclude this portion with a presentation by Mira from Coalition of Communities of Color.
Hi everyone, my name is Mira Mohsini. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a senior researcher at the Coalition of Communities of Color. The report that I'm here to summarize is called Police Violence is Hate Violence, Testimonies of Police Brutality from the Streets of Portland. The report presents firsthand testimonials like the ones that you've heard here from Portlanders who've been the targets of and witnesses to police violence and hate. These testimonials were reported to Portland United Against Hate through its crowdsourced tool called Report Hate PDX, where members of the public can submit hate incident reports. Between May 31st and July 20th, 2020, 35 incidents reported that law enforcement officers are the perpetrators of violence. These 35 reports represent the experiences of thousands of protesters and demonstrate that the Portland Police Bureau was engaging in the violent suppression of protests long before federal law enforcement officers arrived. This report is a snapshot in time. 31% of the targets of police violence are BIPOC. 60% of the targets of police violence are white. We're mindful that the majority of incidents reported are from white protesters, yet the prevalence of incidents from BIPOC people exceeds their proportion of the general Portland population. We're also aware that the experiences of Black protesters are less represented in this report, even though Black folks are disproportionately impacted by police violence. The data presented shows that police officers are using aggressive crowd control measures in response to nonviolent demonstrations that leave many with lasting injuries and trauma. The data also demonstrates that the police are targeting journalists, legal observers, and medics. The report describes, sometimes in great detail, the grotesque measures used as crowd control on protests, despite compelling evidence that the use of force on protesters doesn't keep police or protesters safe. The data includes 10 reports of flashbangs, 20 reports of chemical agents like tear gas and pepper spray, 8 reports of being shoved, tackled, or grabbed by the neck, 4 reports of being hit with batons, 23 reports of the use of rubber bullets or other munitions, 4 reports of threats, intimidation, and verbal harassment. Though law enforcement uses so-called lethal, less lethal weapons against protesters, these weapons have lasting effects. Tear gas can cause pulmonary edema, permanent eye damage, and increases the risk of contracting a respiratory illness. Rubber bullets permanently disable about 15% of those struck with them. An updated addendum to the report has been published to share data between August 6th and September 15th, 2020. This data tracks with the findings in the police violence report that I just summarized. Of the additional 9 incidents that were submitted to Report Hate PDX, the majority are reports of physical assaults perpetrated by law enforcement, as well as a few reports of legal observers and medics being targeted. Thank you, and I yield my time.
Thank you, Mira. We will now hear from Rabbi Debra Kolodny to introduce the next half of our event.
First, I want to thank everybody who's spoken so eloquently and really appreciate your taking the time and also the emotional labor to re-experience your trauma so that those who are in attendance, who have not been in the streets, who have not witnessed this experience or experienced this, can learn the truth, because we live in a day and age when truth is hard to come by and people don't know what to believe. The service you're providing to help Portlanders and hopefully the whole country understand what's happening here is invaluable. We are switching gears. I'd like to invite everybody, do your due. If you do a deep cleansing breath to kind of bring yourself back to center and release whatever toxins, stress, anxiety has arisen in you as a result of listening to this incredible lived harm. Just invite you to kind of bring yourself back here in this moment. We are about to hear from 8 experts who have written books and spent their entire lives speaking truth to power on the issue of policing and the impacts, the horrific impacts of policing on our people. We will send you information and detail about who each of them is. We'll give you bios in our follow-up email, but I'm just going to now open up the floor to our first speaker, Professor Alex Vitale. I said to him when we first got on the call that I am a rabbi, but I am fond of saying that his book, The End of Policing, is my other Bible. So we are so grateful to have you, Professor Vitale. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to both listen to this powerful testimony and to provide my thoughts about what's been occurring in Portland. I had the opportunity to visit Portland last fall and in fact met with a number of people on this call this evening and am very moved by the horrific stories we've heard. And I want to think about them in 4 different ways, at 4 different levels for a minute. First, we started off with this testimony about the kinds of munitions that people have been subjected to and the inappropriate ways that they have been used. And it seems like there's very little question that individual officers have used munitions in ways that are contrary to the manufacturer's advice about the use of that weapon, best practice, and the specific policies of the Portland Police Department. But that individual, and this also goes for, use of force in terms of hand-to-hand beatings, et cetera. Now, this level is the level of individual officer misconduct. And this is definitely a problem. And it does call for strategies of individual level accountability for those officers. But we also need to go to the next level, which is to think about the problem of the militarization of the Portland Police Department. Why have they invested so heavily in acquiring this huge array of paramilitary weaponry, both from direct purchases and from transfers from the Department of Defense? This is part of a national trend of the militarization of policing and the intensification of the police response to protest activity. We see more use of military and paramilitary hardware that is designed not just to suppress these demonstrations, but also to intimidate those who might want to participate and to create a patina around the demonstrations that makes them seem illegitimate and dangerous. This means we need to ask some tough questions about why these paramilitary units have been allowed to proliferate and why all this military and paramilitary hardware has been approved to be purchased and to be used in the way that it's used. And it's important to note that this is not just restricted to the policing of demonstrations. One of the biggest problems with the militarization of policing is the kind of mission creep that typically occurs when these kinds of munitions and special units are created, which is that they get used in routine policing, the serving of drug warrants, no-knock raids, which can also be a significant source of harm in the community. The third level is to understand that's what's been happening in Portland and across the country is a counter-protest by the police. I think unlike the protests of 5 or 6 years ago in the wake of the police killings of Mike Brown and Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and so many others, there's a real sense in which the protests that are occurring now represent a kind of existential threat to police departments. That the rhetoric about reforming the police has been largely dismissed by street protesters, and the demands are to significantly reduce the scope and power of policing. And this challenges not only the immediate financial and professional interests of the police, but it also challenges their worldview. They see themselves as the lone defenders of order and a safe society. And so they view protests that question their authority and legitimacy as an assault on civilization as we know it. And they are taking that out on the protesters. In the process, ironically, they're showing the public exactly what the protesters have been claiming, which is that police are ultimately violence workers, and that despite 5 or 6 years of talk about police reform, the police remain in all important ways unreformed. The solution to this is not individual level disciplinary changes. It's to really hold the whole department accountable. It means holding command staff accountable. It means firing commanders who either authorized or looked the other way as police engaged in widespread human rights, civil rights, and legal abuses. It also means that we should look to defund paramilitary units and defund the policing more broadly and replace as many of their functions as possible with nonviolent alternatives. But there's a fourth level that needs to be considered here, and it's the level of political failure. What we've seen, again, in so many cities across the country is a political failure. Mayors and the president turning demands to rethink our over-reliance of policing over to the police to manage, because they're not willing to significantly engage these issues through a legitimate political process. Now, the mayor of Portland tried to shift the burden of that onto the Trump administration by pointing the finger at Trump's use of federal law enforcement officers that engaged in widespread misconduct. And there was a kind of understanding that Trump's motives in doing that were overtly political, that he wanted to respond to the very legitimate demands occurring on the streets by criminalizing them, by defining them as criminal and disorderly and a threat to democracy, and by trying to win votes by attacking the demonstrations. But really the same dynamic is true for the local administration. Their decision not to seriously engage the demands of demonstrators about the role of the Portland police, but instead to turn that over to the police to manage the protests. This is a political failure, and it means that ultimately the person who needs to be accountable for the level of abuse that we've seen on the streets of Portland is the mayor himself. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Alex Vitale. Our next presenter will be Dr. Anita Randolph.
For some reason, it's saying I'm unable to start my video, but good evening, everybody. Oh, start my video. Let's see. There we go. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. I'm just very moved by all of the stories that I have heard thus far. That was an awesome rhetoric that we just heard. I'm just really enjoying just being here with you guys. Today I kind of like just prepared a, I guess my own like just testimony of what it's been like for me being out as a street medic. I am transitioning into a faculty position at University of Minnesota. I just finished my fellowship in the Department of Psychiatry here at OHSU. And I've been going out serving as a street medic and providing PPE and mutual aid for various groups such as Don't Shoot, Wall of Vets, and OHSU had a street medic group as well. And so I'm just gonna read my last paragraph and then yield the rest of my time, because I think everyone has spoken so eloquently, it's not much else I can add to the conversation. So the last paragraph of my testimony reads, like many others, my involvement in Portland's BLM protests has come at a high cost. In my experience, the vast majority of Portland protesters are raising their voices peacefully. Yet, I have both witnessed and experienced indiscriminate and disproportionate use of force at the hands of local and federal officers. I've repeatedly seen and experienced officers indiscriminately firing tear gas or other chemical irritants into an entire crowd of people for no apparent reason other than they were demonstrating against systemic racism in policing and police violence. I've witnessed officers leaving medics who were trying to aid injured protesters, black and blue from head to toe. Many were shoved to the ground, hit by batons, or shot with least lethal munitions while visibly being marked and providing care. This was our everyday story being out at the protests. Beyond what I've witnessed, the memories of events will never evade me. The countless hours of talking people through their shock and terror of no longer being protected by their white skin haunts me daily. They are expressing fear of being hunted down, harassed, and beaten in the streets, no different than a person of color like myself. I have repeatedly been subject to tear gas and other chemical irritants deployed by local and federal officers, the harmful effects which lasted for hours or days after the initial exposure. I've experienced tear gas exposure so severely that I dropped to my knees in pain and needed help myself. This is just a glimpse of what I experienced as a street medic with other doctors in the field. And so I'll yield back the rest of my time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Randolph. Our next presenter will be Dr. Rohini Har. You're on mute, Dr. Har.
Thank you. I'm a researcher and a physician in Berkeley, California, and I've studied protests and the use of crowd control weapons, primarily with Physicians for Human Rights. I wanted to share a few broader points. And I think in the context of what we're talking about, these are important to remember. One is that protests and demonstrations are one of the fundamental pillars of the democratic process. In this country, it's a constitutional right to express yourself and to assemble. Two, in studying protests, the vast majority are peaceful, and even when the protests turn violent, the vast majority of protesters in those crowds are still peaceful. The mere fact that a demonstration is deemed illegal or there are individuals who are violent does not justify dispersing an entire assembly or using weapons. And third, the most effective method to prevent violence in protests and demonstrations is to engage in negotiations and open dialogue with protesters and law enforcement. The use of crowd control weapons should be an absolute last resort when dealing with genuine and imminent threats to safety of people present, and only after other options have been attempted. So when crowd control weapons are deployed, there are three important guidelines. One, it must be necessary. Two, their use must be proportionate. And three, they must not be misused. Unfortunately, that is not what we've seen in the United States the past few months. I really don't know of any protest that I've studied where the use of crowd control weapons has de-escalated tensions. It often does quite the opposite. I've worked with many other colleagues on behalf of Physicians for Human Rights to research the health effects of crowd control weapons. Most recently, we published a report on the use of these kinetic impact projectiles, things like rubber bullets and foam batons, though they're much more than that. The report is called Shot in the Head, and it finds 115 people with significant head injuries in the past few months alone. I'll share briefly with you because 13 of those are in Portland. And looking at this talk today, I expect that that is just the tip of the iceberg and there's far more. You are welcome to explore this website on your own, and there's a map so you can look at, individual cases and source them. But if you look very briefly at Portland, this was, in this entire area, and there's so many different cases. In all of these cases, what you'll find is that there's really no evidence that these protesters were violent or dangerous. None of these protesters have been arrested. Mr. Miller, who spoke eloquently a little bit before, he's here as well, and a few other of the, and Mr. Jennings as well. And I would say that not only that, but if you look at Portland's police guidelines on the use of force, not only do they violate the use of force that we've seen in Portland the past few months violates both the Constitution, but also their own policies. And that's really troubling. We've had a number of research outputs that I'm happy to share with you if you need. Our research shows that when crowd control weapons are used unnecessarily, disproportionately, and when they're misused, we see more injuries, disabilities, and even deaths among unarmed civilians. Specifically, kinetic impact projectiles, including rubber bullets, are dangerous when they're used in crowds. At short ranges, at long ranges, they're indiscriminate and dangerous. Tear gas is used so pervasively around the country and around the world that many people, even children, the elderly, those with chronic lung problems, pregnant women, they're especially vulnerable. I'm heartened to know that we are at a place to take specific steps to ensure that protests against police violence will no longer be met with more police violence. And I would be happy to answer any questions at the end. I would end by saying there's so many important reasons to protest and demonstrate right now that the use of these weapons should not be intimidating or chilling us away from doing so. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Haar. Our next presenter will be Dr. Jan Hocken.
My name is Jan Hocken, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm a professor emeritus of psychology at Portland State University and a clinical psychologist. I'm also a member of several divisions of the American Psychological Association, calling for major reductions in police budgets rather than continuing reform efforts through bias testing and bias training and psychological testing. These programs have been largely ineffective in addressing the problems they were created to solve. As a psychologist, my field research includes studying responses to social violence. My work has taken me to different regions of the US, as well as research carried out through universities in the UK and countries in West Africa. In the area of policing, it's important to recognize the unique powers held by police officers. They are sanctioned by states to administer violence against their own citizens, including lethal violence in situations where officers feel threatened or are able to justify this use of force. Black and brown people are more apt to be perceived by the police as threatening, as are the masses of people around the country in recent months demanding major changes in the exercise of police powers. In the current Black Lives Matter movement, there are lessons to be drawn from the uprisings in cities throughout the US from between 1967 and 1970. The causes of the uprisings, like today, were deeply intertwined with forms of deep economic inequality, housing discrimination, and structural racism. Police brutality was the arm of the state that protected an unequal social order. Intensified policing, from use of weapons, tear gas, mass arrests, and other displays of force, was the state's response to the uprisings themselves. Public concerns have been raised over violence on the part of some protesters here in Portland. Set against police violence and the tremendous arsenal and lethal power of the state, these incidents on the part of protesters are relatively minor. We see on the daily news how images of water bottles thrown or fires in trash cans are magnified for political purposes. But what I see as someone who's studied violence for much of my career are people coming together in profound yet imperfect ways to challenge the status quo. We are now familiar with George Floyd's plaintive cry as he was dying under the boot of the police, "I can't breathe." Social change is not always orderly. Sometimes people held back for so long, deprived of so much in a land of abundance, do cross lines in acceptable behavior. But they need more breathing room. And as a psychologist, I'm more struck by the vast landscape of protests that display tremendous empathy, self-control, and mutual aid, including during these highly stressful times. This is all the more remarkable given the militarized powers of the police the protesters are up against. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hocken. Our next presenter is Dr. Maureen Katz.
Hi, my name is Maureen Katz, and I'm a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, clinical professor at UCSF, and a member of the American Psychoanalytic Association Holmes Commission for Racial Equality and Doctors for Camp Closure. I've worked for 35 years with survivors of torture, state-sanctioned violence, and state terror. I want to thank those who have courageously testified today, as well as the organizers of these testimonies. I can say without clinical ambiguity that the actions carried out by police and federal military agents in Portland, Oregon are psychological acts of state terror. Let's review just one instance that recently happened to individuals and therefore to the population at large in Portland, Oregon. Individuals were abducted off the street, forced without choice into unmarked vans, driven around, bound and restrained, held at gunpoint, where abductors refused to identify themselves clearly, their questions were not answered, and after many hours of terrible uncertainty, the people abducted were released in random locations, told it was a mistake, no charges leveled against them, and personal possessions not returned. The horrific testimonies of police firing weapons upon citizens for months on end that we have just heard about speak for themselves. It is well documented in the medical literature that police violence and tactics of state terror are used by authoritarian governments to control the population at large with fear. Individuals who are abducted face terrible and lasting psychological trauma and symptoms of post-traumatic stress, nightmares, dissociation, startle reflexes, anxiety and depression, paralysis, and an inability to act. The effects are often transmitted intergenerationally, irrevocably harming those individuals as well. The audience for these actions, though, is the rest of us, and the message is clear. Stay put, do not engage in legal assembly or civil disobedience, or you, your families, and your friends will be subject to terrifying, unpredictable military and police actions. The actions in the stealth of night are meant to induce terror, to intimidate. We know from psychoanalytic studies of emerging authoritarian regimes in Latin America in the 1980s that state terror and police violence are meant to quell opposition in the greater society. 93% of the Black Lives Matter protests this last summer in the United States were peaceful. Yet on Thursday last week in New York City and Aurora, Colorado, with excessive shows of force, SWAT teams and canine units were sent to individuals' houses, apartment complexes, and even surrounding a car parked in a Home Depot to arrest individuals who had been involved in planning protests in June. There were no current threats or evidence of planning armed insurrections. The extreme show of force sends a very clear, chilling message to all of us who see and report on it. It is meant to paralyze civil engagement. In Portland, Oregon, these forces operated with impunity. They were deliberately unidentifiable by badge or agency. The impunity of the police and military further demoralize and stifle political opposition, promoting attacks on free inquiry and political difference, while imposing a terrifying and unpredictable social reality. A disinformation campaign depicts the Custom and Border Patrol operating far from the border as peacekeeping, guardians while they employ military hardware, projectiles, chemical weapons, and abductions against civilian dissidents. This traumatogenic political environment is intended to drive citizens to disavow their identities, values, and their capacity to believe and act on their perceptions of reality. The social contract that assumes our elected representatives to be reliable arbiters of all citizens' democratic rights has been deeply damaged by the actions against the people in Portland. We do not want our government and policing forces to be the agents of this kind of psychological and political terror. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Katz. Our next presenter is Shane Burley.
Thanks so much. So for more than 120 days, protesters in Portland have been challenging police brutality and have faced police impact munitions, tear gas, swinging batons, and draconian criminal charges. I've seen protesters hit by police munitions. I've seen people really seriously hurt, while others have been shoved to the ground, punched and beaten with batons and dragged away. But what I want to talk about is the only time the police seem to stand down, which is when the Proud Boys and other far-right groups who come to Portland to attack the left and are allowed to do so with impunity, often illegally using weapons such as bear mace, sap gloves, metal batons, paintball guns, and actually brandishing firearms. When analyzing the data for a recent article, it was clear that the vast majority of the violence that's taking place at both the protests in Portland and across the country are from a combination of unaccountable police attacks and far-right vigilantes who plow cars into protesters, open fire on them, and beat them with blunt objects. Since 2017, dozens of anti-fascist protests have taken place in Portland, often in confrontation with violent groups like the Proud Boys or Patriot Prayer, and the police are just turning a blind eye to the far-right violence and usually firing munitions at anti-fascist protesters instead. In June of 2017, just weeks after a Patriot Prayer attendee murdered 2 people in an Islamophobic attack, Patriot Prayer was allowed to hold a rally, and Portland police actually attacked anti-fascist protesters with impact munitions and illegally kettled them. In June of 2018, while reporting on a Proud Boy gathering, I observed police lead basically 100 far-right brawlers directly into a crowd of anti-fascists, resulting in the most shocking violence I've ever actually seen in person, as gang attacks on individuals on the ground. It literally left blood running in the street. 2 months later, Portland police attacked nonviolent anti-fascist protesters and then allowed a mob of far-right extremists back to do the same thing. A local reporter even overheard police discussing how they're going to let them fight it out. When members of far-right organizations had warrants or were filmed engaging in street attacks, police basically did nothing, ignored them, and allowed them to continue. Proud Boy Tusitala Tiny Toisi had attacked protesters in front of Portland police despite open warrants for his arrest, and he even came back recently. This happened at the most recent Proud Boy event on August 22nd. And text messages between police and far-right organizations revealed a really supportive relationship, including police providing real-time tactical information and advising the members on how to open warrants, or protect them from open warrants. When Patriot Prayer was found staging snipers in a parking garage above an anti-fascist protest, the police did not arrest or charge the snipers, and they hid the incident from the public for months. Documents from the police quote them as saying that the far right is more mainstream than the anti-fascist protesters, and this reflects the disparate way they're treated. The police have even been the source of far-right conspiracy theories, such as the June 2019 theory that quick dry cement was being thrown at disguised as milkshakes. Most recently, local police agencies have been caught spreading the dangerous conspiracy theory that Antifa was lighting wildfires, which has led to militia checkpoints around the state. The police have been protecting the far right, including allowing a large march of Proud Boys invading the city from around the country, taking over public bridges and public parks. Meanwhile, anti-fascist demonstrators who are from the city and are much more representative of the public of Portland than the far right are facing extensive injuries and criminal charges for protesting, being hit with impact munitions that goes back years. The real threat to public safety is the police creating a pathway for vigilantes who want to victimize protesters. There are two types of police violence go at play: the violence they commit, and such as the killing of George Floyd, and the violence they refuse to stop, like that of the Proud Boys. They need to have responsibility held for both. And this is happening right now. This weekend, August 26th, Proud Boys are coming to Portland, and in their advertising, they are talking about Kyle Rittenhouse and other white vigilantes as their inspiration. So this violence is a very, very pressing threat, and it's really debatable if the police will do any form of intervention at all. On August 22nd, they refuse to intervene in any way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shane. Our next presenter is Hyung Nam.
Okay, I'm going to be sharing my screen here and turning off my own video when that starts. And my name is Hyung Nam, and I'm an organizer with the Portland Metro People's Coalition. And I also served as a budget advisory committee member for the Portland Police Bureau recently. As we've seen, police brutality comes at great cost to society. There are thousands of people killed and lives irreparably devastated by police violence. There's a loss of public safety and trust in the collective good when police perpetrate unlawful violence, and there is the financial cost. With police impunity baked into the legal system, civil suits are one of the few venues for victims of police violence to seek redress. For many cities, settling lawsuits in police misconduct cases is a significant burden. New York City, for example, shelled out $335 million in 2017 alone to settle thousands of misconduct cases. In the last decade, Chicago paid out an average of more than $100 million. In 2019, Los Angeles paid $91 million in police misconduct cases. This may be Portland's future. The city has paid as much as $2.3 million in settlements in individual police misconduct cases in the past, which does not include extensive legal fees. Expectations are misconduct settlements will soar as a result of extensive police violence during the last 4 months of protests. More than 52 new claims have been filed since May, and Independent Police Review says they have received hundreds of complaints of police brutality since almost daily protests began in May 2020. The financial costs raise a number of important questions. Who should pay? Is it possible to reform payments to discourage police violence? Why and how did Wall Street banks come to profit from police brutality settlements in many cities? What is the public's responsibility to victims of police violence and survivors of those killed by police? How can these payments and police violence be reined in? One answer to these questions comes from Action Center on Race and the Economy. In 2018, it released a report, Police Brutality Bonds, How Wall Street Profits from Police Violence, that details the ways cities take out bonds to pay off misconduct settlements, which result in greater public costs from interest and underwriting fees to banks to pay large settlements that can often double what they have to pay. The Action Center goes on to say, there is no way to create financial incentives to stop police violence because violence is inherent to policing. Highlighting the amount of police misconduct settlements or shifting the responsibility to payments onto police departments, profit-driven private insurance companies, or different government entities will not stop police from harming people, but it will likely harm people harmed by police. The most likely consequence of focusing attention on these payments is not that the police violence will stop or slow down because it is a feature, not a bug. What these approaches will do is simply create stronger incentives to deny or reduce compensation to the people harmed by violence, to avoid public scrutiny, to avoid cuts to department budgets, to avoid cutting into the bottom line. If you are shocked by the amount of money spent on police settlements and by the amount of violence and harm they represent, the best response is to work to decrease the power of the police to enact that violence. In other words, the best way to reduce the amount of police violence settlements is to reduce the ultimately end policing itself, not the settlements paid to the people harmed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hyung Nam. Our last speaker will be Kaniku, who is going to wrap up this section of our event.
Hi, everyone. So like Alex, I actually want to split my little 4 minutes into about 4 parts. And we're going to do it via a series of question and answer sort of format. Today, I'm here to speak during this panel about the intersections of trauma within BIPOC communities. This is something that I have a level of expertise on, being a member of the Black and Indigenous communities, which have experienced genocide on American soil for millennia. As such, I am an expert by birth on surviving within these systems. So the first question that I'd like to ask in regards to the conversation we're having today about policing is one that gets asked often, which is, what comes next? The answer to that is trauma-informed, victim-led restorative justice. So basically what I'm saying the real next step must be is a shifting of the conversation towards community education about the intersections of our oppressive systems and the impact of both different and often varied marginalizations upon our collective psyche. So the path to restorative justice then is dependent upon the decolonization of our understandings about healthcare and justice as these terms are currently used. So question 2 to dive into is, what does trauma-informed even mean? Now, many of us understand the basic concept of trauma, right? As a deeply distressing, disturbing, and/or scary experience / injury. But unfortunately, many more people remain unaware of the often disabling, sometimes permanent, and even physical effects of trauma on the body and the mind. To explain that point briefly, I want to share with you all a term that I know many might not be familiar with, which is psychosomatic illnesses. Psychosomatic illnesses are physical illnesses or other conditions caused or made worse by one's mental state. Essentially, something we all must understand is that the state of our mental health has been undeniably proven capable of directly impacting our physical well-being. When we talk about how trauma has physical effects on both the body and mind, it's important to begin to understand this. We know we must have at least a working knowledge of the different, often overlapping types of trauma. For everyone on this call today who's been out in the streets or otherwise It's important for us to all understand that we are simultaneously going through shared global trauma in this moment. There are so many different types of these traumas that overlap. In talking about the BIPOC community, Black, Brown, and Indigenous immigrant or immigrant peoples, we have to talk about intergenerational trauma, which I know was nodded to by one of our other experts. When we talk about intergenerational trauma, we have to understand that trauma of the mind can literally impact the way that our brains function. We've seen time and time again in studies that traumatic stress can be associated with lasting changes in various areas of the brain, often at the same time. It's one of the reasons that you've heard so many people today talk about problems with memory loss, problems with perhaps slurred speech or radiating pain. Personally, I suffer from PTSD, which comes with a comorbid issue of traumatic and random body twitches. Essentially, the limbs of my arms and legs, if I am too stressed out, twitch repeatedly. To be able to continue to go out and protest, personally, I and many other BIPOC people have had to not only already address, but attempt to begin to heal and understand the intergenerational traumas that we're experiencing. Additionally, it's important for us to talk about insidious trauma as it affects oppressed communities. Insidious trauma is something that is, exactly as it sounds, affects you in so many different moments of our day-to-day lives. It's one of the reasons that when we talk about erasing white supremacy, we also have to talk about having a militancy to call out and stop microaggressions as they occur in our day-to-day lives. We also need to talk about community trauma. Outside of community with shared marginalizations, for instance, Black people in the diaspora experiencing the insidious trauma of racism. We also must talk about shared community trauma, like what we're all experiencing here in Portland, Oregon, and have been experiencing for, I must explicitly state, years under the rule of law of Ted Wheeler, our local police commissioner, whose local officers have been tear gassing us and have been firing these crowd control munitions, often at close point range, at community members, creating a trauma-like situation across our entire city. Now that we've covered these three overarching types of trauma, it's also important for people to understand the impacts of both direct and indirect trauma. It is not just those of us who have the capacity, privilege, ability to be able to come outside to protest in person who are experiencing trauma, but also those of us at home living trauma throughout the constant push of media imagery. We see in the mass media a consistent effort to continue to show trauma as a means of waking people up, when instead what we understand it has done is continue to desensitize us to these traumas that are happening as we continuously experience the indirect trauma of seeing these incidents firsthand. It's why so many Black people online are continuously asking for white individuals to stop sharing graphic and violent imagery of Black people's murders. At this point, it is nothing but a reminder to our Black communities that our lives are not worth saving and are not valued above property. As such, it's so important for us to understand that these types of indirect trauma are just as valid and just as impactful as direct trauma. Additionally, the last thing I want to explain is that there's a difference between acute and chronic trauma. Acute trauma is often a one-time incident. Chronic trauma is something that happens over and over again on a repeated basis. So that means that here in Portland, if you are a Black, Brown, or Indigenous person who is out on the front lines night after night, you're experiencing intergenerational trauma as compounded with insidious trauma of racism, as compounded with community trauma, as compounded with the direct traumas of police brutality, as compounded with the chronic nature of these traumas on a day-to-day basis. That really leads me to my third question that we want to answer today, which is often asked in follow-up to what comes next, which is, how do we stop crime? I explain all the different types of trauma to help us understand that when we ask how do we stop crime, we need to understand that we must address the root issues of crime, which are the critically unstable, unreliable, and failing systems of care promised by the state, which force Black, Brown, Indigenous, and immigrant communities into poverty by intentional design. Much of crime occurring in so-called first world countries like the United States is intentionally manufactured by a system which continues to rely on slave labor, and a system which pushes the poor into modern day plantations by their more palatable new name of prison yards. It's important for us to understand that the traumas that we experience and the crime that so many people discuss is actually a desperate attempt for survival and a system that is designed from the bottom up to push us down into failure and to keep us trapped under genocidal traumas that do not allow us even a moment to breathe, to imagine, or to think about the better world that we can build together with a decolonized point of view. It's one of the reasons why trauma is such an important part of my teachings. So the last question is, as many might be wondering, where can I begin? And the biggest thing that I want to encourage all those today with an interest in seeing a world without policing is to sit on, digest, and accept a hard truth. Police abolition and the abolition of prisons are not the easy path forward. Instead, we fight against an entire infrastructure designed to not only slow us down, but to brutalize and destroy our hope. Instead, I encourage you all to begin to attempt to understand and process the traumas that you are experiencing, to engage in acts of radical vulnerability with your communities, to understand that the ways that we decolonize mental health care are by understanding that the individualistic approach we've been taught through this pull yourself up by the bootstraps propaganda wants you to be alone. Instead, we know that communities must come together to provide intimate, radical, trauma-informed, and victim-led restorative justice and care systems. We know that, as we have seen across Indigenous communities and in Indigenous nations, for millennia, community is dependent upon mutual systems of care. It's dependent upon a very basic premise, which understands that all are entitled to life, no matter their level of ability, be it physical, mental, no matter the color of their skin, no matter the skills that they may or may not provide. We know that all labor is skilled labor, and all labor depends on an opportunity for us, or all of our success depends upon us coming together to create these joint coordinated systems to move forward collectively with healing and with intentionality. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kaniku. Now we'll have Rabbi Deb, who will introduce the last section, question session and next steps. Rabbi Debra.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to hand it right over to Arun, who I hope has been harvesting questions that press who are present have been feeding into a Google Doc for us. So Arun, if you can show yourself on the screen and take it away. And maybe what we could do at this point is ask everybody who's a presenter to put your video on because we don't know who's going to get what question, and we can manage it more easily by seeing one another.
Yeah, just I'm waiting for journalists, this is your chance to ask questions. We have one from Letitia Jensen from Willamette Week. It's a two-part question. I'll ask the first part. This is for victims of police violence. She's asking, has anyone who has experienced police violence been able to obtain an officer's identification from a badge number? Has any victims been able to obtain the ID? Because we understand this is a very big problem in terms of police hiding their identification. Do any of the people who've experienced police violence want to speak to that?
This is Andrew Tolman. I can speak to it just really quick. I know that I had one arresting, or not the officer who arrested me, but the person who that officer reported to had a number. but everyone else I was unable to see. I also had an experience during the uprising where police people of different, PPB and other units and agencies made an arrest onto my friend's car as we were trying to leave the area. And on camera, the officer refused to give his name, any identification. And as we continued to inquire for that, he said, "It seems to me like you're just here to agitate. It seems to me like you're just here to fight." And that was our cue kind of maybe to take off. And so I have only one time, like I said, identified that one officer, but everyone else was unidentifiable.
Okay. Does anyone else want to speak to that? So let me ask the second part of the question. So is anyone seeking any form of justice from the incident of police violence they were subjected to? And I know a number of people have filed civil lawsuits. So if anybody wants to speak to that, please just speak up. Andre, Erica, I know both of you have Elijah. If any of you want to speak up, you need to unmute yourselves.
I am working on a lawsuit with my attorney in the ACLU. We have filed charges.
Erica, would you like to say anything about your case?
Yeah. I don't have too much information about going on. I was not able to identify the officer.
I can't understand Eric. Anyone else having connection troubles? I just wanted to make sure that Erica had a chance to share where we could all hear it.
I also cannot hear Erica.
Do folks want to try turning off your video to take a load off the system?
I really don't know who was my case, I think, but yeah, I don't have a ton of information about. I'm sorry, it might be.
Do folks want to try?
I noticed that Erica's audio feed has ended, and so, can everybody hear me okay? Can you give me like a sign?
Yes.
Yes. Great. I have not been arrested and I do not have a pending lawsuit, but I did want to note that we must have asked at least 6 to 10 people to testify who could not testify because they did have pending lawsuits. They were either a party to the ACLU or another test case litigation against the police, or they were another form of lawsuit, and their attorneys asked them not to testify. We also have people who have gotten federal charges in addition to the county charges, and who are terrified and did not want to speak publicly in any kind of forum. So I just wanted to note that in addition to the specifics that anyone is very welcome to share, we're living in an environment that I want to amplify, I guess, what Dr. Katz said about this being state-sponsored terrorism designed to create fear and to squelch our the exercise of our First Amendment rights. And we see that even in people who opted out of this forum for fear of some kind of retribution.
I have a question for Dr. Anita Randolph. If she can unmute herself and put her video on. It's about if she can talk about her research on the effects of smoke in terms of the neurological impacts, because there's been often a massive amount of smoke deployed by the police forces, not just tear gas, but actual smoke grenades. And also, you know, all these various impact munitions also release smoke as well. And what is the effect of that?
Yes, so I did an extensive amount of smoke inhalation research prior to coming to OHSU at the University of Texas Medical Branch. And one of the things that I focused on was how inhaling a large mass of smoke actually affects your blood-brain barrier. So the smoke that are in these studies that I guess when people are Googling my name that are coming up, it's more like from intense burning fire, not necessarily from the tear gas that is being used right now in the protest. I did, however, talk about the effects of tear gas in different organ systems in the paper that is published on the Don't Shoot's website, but not necessarily, I just focused on like what happens with your, you know, respiratory system and your gastrointestinal system. And when I focused on the nervous system, it's more like peripheral nervous system, like why do you have this intense pain? And it's basically because tear gas affects how these neurons are activated and how they depolarize. So the threshold is changed. So you get like this huge changes in intensity because of that. Unfortunately, I don't know how long that they last because a lot of the tear gas research that I was finding in my literature review was actually redacted by the government. So most of the research that I quoted in this paper was done by the military. And unfortunately, they only released 6,000 individuals, but we know way more than 6,000 people are tear gas because that's a part of their like boot camp training that they go through. But that's all that I have for the central nervous system specifically.
Okay, thank you. I have a question for either for Shane or Alex, Shane Burley and or Alex Vitale, which is, can you talk about the role of the media in terms of either how they have been reporting on collusion and facilitation between the police and the far right, and the role of the media in terms of accurately representing or not representing the police as using politicized violence for political ends?
I could start at this really quick. There's been a general failure, I think, to understand the depth of the police collaboration with the far right, to see it as maybe incidental, or to actually assume that the police's behavior was neutral in some way, and therefore, you know, likely the left did something irresponsible, or maybe it's because there was more people, or something along those lines, instead of seeing this with its historical relevance. I mean, this collaboration has a long, long history in Oregon because the far right has a long history kind of surrounding the deep blue areas of the state. And this goes back to the 30s and has lots and lots of precedent. And so I think having a better historical lens for understanding how this has happened, both historically, but also contemporarily, will give people a better sense of that. I think also there's been a misrepresentation about understanding where the violence is coming from. A lot of people talked about this statistically today. The violence is overwhelmingly coming from either the police or from far-right vigilantes. And I think even just looking at each individual evening gives us a snapshot into this. The vast capacity for violence is held almost uniformly on one side. I mean, like, I think we understand that protesters, both illegal and not illegal, are basically capable of little more than trash fires in comparison to what the police are doing. So at any given protest, we're talking about smashed windows, and the response is basically weapons of war used in the streets of Portland. And it's becoming so it's increasing so rapidly, and the injuries are becoming so numerous that it's almost, it's beyond hyperbole to start talking about protester violence in relationship to what the police are actually doing. And so I think what's important that the press often misses is to look at exactly what the police are doing and to put it in the proper context compared to what the protesters are even capable of, which is so much less.
I'm not sure if this exactly addresses a question, but one of the problems with the coverage of these events is the longstanding tendency of the press to want to relate primarily to official sources. And the police are always treated as an official source in a largely uncritical fashion, so that the police explanation for what happened is always treated as the official version, while accounts from demonstrators are alleged or often just completely absent from these descriptions. The irony of this is that what we've seen in Portland and across the country is indiscriminate police violence directed at the press. And this is part of the police counter-protest, I think, that we've seen nationally, which is that there is this idea among police that the press are sympathetic to the demonstrators and are helping to drive this mood of anti-police, in their eyes, nonsense. And so we see press getting singled out for abusive treatment by the police.
Do any of the those who've been subjected to police violence, I know a few of you have already addressed it, but anyone want to say anything more about the chilling effect this has had on your right to protest, or if it's had a counter effect that it's made you more resolved to go out and protest?
I have physically been unable to go and protest. I usually hold a very large sign that's very hard not to be able to read from a distance on two poles that stake it up over my head so that I can really get people's attention to what is going on and what we need to be focusing on. Since August 29th, haven't been up to the protest that my daughter and I started on June 2nd, and spent almost every day up there. We did spend every day up there for the first 7 weeks, and then I did take a day off, and we organized to a point where we could really keep it sustainable and have longevity up there. The only days that there has not been anybody up there representing that corner in Arbor Lodge were a few of the worst days during smoke. So that was really, I mean, it's kept on going even though I haven't been up there. I am very fearful for everybody that is still up there, especially this coming Saturday with the Proud Boys being in town. I am fearful of the person that attacked me, and I'm fearful for my family because there's some serious targeting that's happening from police. One drove by my house today, and I was like, are they doing that because they know where I live and they know, I don't know. And I consider myself very lucky that my injuries are not worse or fatal. And I also recognize the fact that the privilege that I still have in this country with the color of my skin has allowed for those injuries not to be worse. I do feel very resolved in the fact that I will be back out there as soon as I can, because that is privilege not to get back out there. So.
Thank you. Andre, you wanted to speak?
Yeah, up until my injury, I was protesting every single day. Was really out there every night. So when I got hit on July 22nd, it took me away from protesting, and I wasn't able to go out there for a couple of weeks. I did go out there one time. It was the last night that the feds was out there, and it caused a lot of anxiety. There was a lot of PTSD. I stayed far away. I was even in like the middle of the park, and they just started firing in the park from the top of the building. So it creates a lot of anxiety for me. A lot of PTSD when I go out there. Like, I'm always just very high vigilant of what's going on around me. Always looking around, even having people near me, you know, just looking around and making sure that things are all right. Not only has it, you know, caused a lot of trauma just for me to be able to go out there, but every time that I go out there, it also causes a lot of trauma for my family and my 4 kids. They worry about me constantly if I'm going out.
Thank you. Kaniku, did you want to say something?
Yeah, Kaniku here. So I know that for myself, I shared today about trauma and some other things, but I also have experienced police violence on the front lines. And for legal reasons, I'm not going to explain anything more than that. But that being said, I had a concussion. I'm still experiencing side effects from my concussion. I've also had like multiple types of joint pain. And for me and so many others that have been experiencing this type of violence on the front lines, I especially say this in regards to so many Black organizers and Indigenous organizers that I'm in contact and connection with across the country who've been experiencing similar police brutality. For many of us, it really has strengthened the fight. For so many of us, I feel very confident saying that it is of more understanding now than ever the truth which rests in the statement that America, as it's known, has not at all addressed its white supremacy problem. To say that it has is to imply that the single drop in the bucket will be what raises the tide. Instead, it's important for us to understand that so many of us are literally working off of that intergenerational trauma with the fight response as opposed to a flight response. For me, I am all the more continuously enraged and infuriated at the sheer audacity of the United States government to continue to claim first world status, to continue to project itself as an outstanding and global leader in regards to anything at all except genocide, imperialism, capitalism, and fascism. Outside of these 4 areas, America is not great in any way, shape, or form, and never has been as a country founded on genocide. And the current genocide that is coming out from behind closed doors for so many white communities to finally see what we as Black, Brown, and Indigenous people have been begging white communities to understand and recognize as genocide for literal generations is an opportunity for us to teach people the severity of the need for the fight. For so many like myself, we understand that walking outside of our doors every day is being a target. Stepping outside in our day-to-day lives is risking our lives, especially sitting here today as a trans, femme, two-spirit, Afro-Indigenous, queer person that is neurodivergent and disabled. I know, and is also a sex worker, I know intimately the danger that exists in my day-to-day life. And it is strictly because of colonialism, capitalism, and the white supremacy that truly connects them both. So I know that for so many of us, while the answer for some is otherwise, for a lot of us, we are experiencing a even further devotion to the lifelong and life-risking work that is addressing white supremacy and genocide in the United States.
Thank you so much. It's we're a little after 6. Arun, are there other questions, or shall we move to close the event with Rabbi?
There's a question for Dr. Maureen Katz. Dr. Katz, can you speak about, you talk about the use of state terror as society's descent into authoritarianism. In your research, have you learned anything in terms of how civil society has been able to techniques for successfully resisting the state terror as it's kind of creeping forward?
That is a fantastic question. It's just not my studies. I just treat people and I write about it, but there's studies that have been done by people out of Latin America and other parts of the world. What I will say, and try to be brief about, is that the worst psychological position is the bystander position, and that not doing anything creates enormous psychological conflict and worsening anxiety, depression, other kinds of symptoms, you know, a loss of a sense of identity and a sense of whose one's values are, and a consistency with who one knows oneself and one's community to be. And so getting out and being active in a number of ways, depending on what that works for you, whether that's protesting, whether that's going and getting people to go and vote by calling them or knocking on their doors, or whatever is in a COVID time safe for you to do, that those are ways to get a population to resist. And that is the only way to resist it. And it's very successful, right? I mean, that's what we see. It's not an overnight victory, right? And I think the other question that's really come up today is about nonviolent direct action. And that many of the people who spoke today went out to protest about nonviolent direct act ways of doing things. And that communities have to try to be creative just to decide how they're going to respond to the escalating violence from the other side. Thank you.
That's it from my end.
Okay, we're going to go back to Rabbi Deb.
Thank you so much. We can't thank all of you enough who provided firsthand testimony today for your strength and your conviction, your vision and your courage. We honor you and we are with you. We can't thank all of those who provided expert testimony today enough for dedicating your lives to speaking truth to power, to bringing your scientific, strategic, and prophetic wisdom to the life and death struggle we find ourselves in today. We honor you and we are with you. To the press who came to learn and transmit the truth of our experience to the world, we are so grateful for your presence and for your role in our incredibly fragile and teetering democracy. Without the Fourth Estate, we are lost. We are counting on you. To the ASL interpreters and closed captioning support, we so appreciate the access you provided for this important event. And for all of the tireless organizers and electeds who came on this call, who are with us, and to the rest of our participants who came to listen and learn, we look forward to continuing to create true safety and well-being in Portland with you. Moving forward, we will be sending links to the Stop Cop Riots letter that I mentioned in my opening, as well as the Police Violence is Hate Violence report that Mira gave you a summary of, so you can dive more deeply into the issues raised today. We will also send you links so you can get on the mailing lists of PUA, Unite, and the Portland Metro People's Coalition. We will send information about ongoing efforts to demilitarize the Portland Police and further reduce their budget so that dollars can be allocated to organizations that support the services people need to stay safe and healthy. We ask you to hold electeds accountable at the city, county, and state level for addressing police violence during campaign forums and in your voting choices. We will send information out about how to view a video recording of this forum after we've conferred with the speakers about how to do so. We urge you to become allies in this work
by stopping false equivalencies when you hear them between conscious strategic police militarized crowd violence against the people and the rare isolated random individual protester damage of property. People and property are not equivalent. Mass weapons of war and tiny garbage can fires are not equivalent. That being said, we urge people to continue to educate themselves, yourselves, on the history of liberation movements and to remember there was property damage at the Boston Tea Party. There were hundreds of slave uprisings where people were killed that precipitated the end of slavery. Stonewall was a riot, not a lawn party. The self-control of Portland protesters in the face of 400+ years of slavery and genocidal assaults on Black people in this country is quite remarkable. We urge everyone to continue to educate yourselves on the public policies driving policing as we know it today. Let's build a new vision of public safety together. Thank you again to all the organizers. Thank you all for coming. We look forward to working with you. Signing off.